Today's show is sponsored by City Theater. If you are a birthday person and you love making that whole week, maybe month, maybe season all about celebrating your big day, then the play Birthday Candles might be perfect for you. City Theater is presenting Birthday Candles by Noah Heidel and directed by Mark Masterson, and you can catch the show on the South Side from March 8th through the 30th. Join Ernestine as she takes us through a century of birthdays. The play is inquisitive, it's hilarious, it's heartwarming, and it asks big questions about our place in the universe and what we might do for the perfect gift. You can find out more and buy your tickets at citytheatercompany.org. CityCast Pittsburgh is supported by Fulton Commons. If you're looking for a gorgeous co-working space with lots of light and some truly wonderfully funky decor, check out Fulton Commons on the north side. The historic but very well renovated old school building is deep in the neighborhood by a park, tucked away but still super close to anywhere you want to be. They've got offices and common spaces. It's perfect for organizations or individuals, and they even have a shared food production kitchen on site. So there's lots of food-related events for their members. If this sounds like your dream co-working space, visit fultonpgh.org to request a tour. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, this past January was Earth's hottest on record, and last year our state had a record number of tornadoes. With all these severe weather events, we're going to need help responding to and preparing for more major disasters. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump wants to eliminate the federal organization that helps us with that. Today, we're talking about FEMA and whether Pennsylvania can function without them. It's Monday, March 3rd. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Kylie Benz is the Pennsylvania reporter for Inside Climate News. Kylie, welcome back to CityCast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
We are always happy to see your face, although it is not for the happiest of circumstances, this visit. How much money on average does FEMA actually give us here in Pennsylvania?
I think that it varies a lot year to year depending on what happens. So when a major disaster happens here, we will get like an influx of funding. And that's decided based on population and, the state's needs.
Right.
But Pennsylvania probably gets a fairly large amount of funding because we're a populous state.
We have a lot of people and actually a decent amount of land, too.
And a decent amount of land, yeah.
And a big part of your reporting lately has been about severe weather, all the severe weather we've been having. What kinds of disasters are we talking about here? Like recent ones, I guess.
In 2024, we had multiple tornado outbreaks. 2024 was a record year for tornado activity in the United States, and there were tornadoes in Pennsylvania. There was also Hurricane Debbie, which caused flash flooding in Pennsylvania. There was a drought, you might remember, that went on for a long time. It was prolonged drought, prolonged heat waves, and then there were also severe storms.
So that's just in the last year, which already feels sort of staggering. How many of those did FEMA step in for? And I guess, are there any other big recent examples maybe that folks would feel familiar to people?
So the one that FEMA stepped in for Pennsylvania specifically was Hurricane Debbie, where parts of Pennsylvania experienced flash flooding in the wake of the hurricane.
Right.
And then in terms of big outlays of money to Pennsylvania from FEMA in the last few years, after Hurricane Ida, which hit Pennsylvania in 2021, if you'll remember, mostly the southeastern part of the state, it caused a ton of damage. And in the wake of that disaster, FEMA sent more than $100 million to Pennsylvania homeowners and renters to help with housing assistance. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously was a national and a global emergency and disaster, the agency sent Pennsylvania more than $800 million.
I mean, how would we have felt that money? Like, what types of services does an organization like FEMA do for us here in Pennsylvania?
Sure. So they help with all kinds of things. During the pandemic, that money went towards vaccines, towards shelters, towards funeral services,
Hmm.
towards setting up emergency operation centers. And then for something like Hurricane Ida, which caused property damage, the agency sends money that helps people with rebuilding their houses and getting temporary housing. So really important stuff that is vital in the wake of a disaster.
Hmm.
One of the things that FEMA sends money for is firefighting equipment. In 2022, they sent more than $30 million to firefighters in Pennsylvania, and that included $1.7 million to the city of Pittsburgh for firefighting equipment. I think that in Pennsylvania, these funding outlays are particularly important because so many of our fire departments are volunteer based and maybe not operating with a lot of resources or a budget for training and new equipment.
Yeah, those fire trucks cost an enormous amount of money. They need help buying them.
Of course, yeah. And like also things like breathing apparatuses and like training. And this was one of the things that we saw with the East Palestine train derailment a few years ago, that the firefighters who responded initially to that fire and that disaster were volunteers. Some of them were teenagers, and they weren't necessarily trained or have the equipment to deal with something like a train derailment and a chemical fire. And so this is one of the ways that like having other sources of funding and other resources and people who can help in an emergency like that is really critical.
And to that training piece too, like that has broader implications, not just for us here in Pennsylvania, because I thought this was fascinating when I learned about it. A lot of Pennsylvania firefighters travel. They'll go to California and other places that have wildfires and give their time there as well. So like learning how to do a thing here in PA is also helping our neighbors in other states.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that firefighting, just like with FEMA and with our federal response, like disaster relief, firefighting is a collaborative project. It doesn't stop at state lines. And I think a lot of, for the past 40 years or so, our response has been predicated on our ability to share resources and to help each other. And FEMA helps us do that.
Yeah, I mean, who decides that we get that money? Like, is it all the president? Does the governor get involved?
Yes, so the governor definitely gets involved. FEMA only steps in when the governor asks the agency to step in, and then the president.
That's when we hear like that thing about like the governor has declared a what is it? It's not a national disaster. What is it?
An emergency declaration.
Emergency declaration. That's it.
Yeah, so the governor has to ask the president basically to formally declare that there's a disaster that FEMA needs to step in to help the state. The agency will not step in without the state asking for help. And the whole point of this is that the governor has to ask the agency for help because the state can't handle it alone. This is why FEMA exists. It's not the case that the agency kind of like steps in and sort of takes over disaster relief when it hasn't been invited.
Yeah. I mean, how much do we rely on them for things like preparedness? Because like a lot of this is like, they'll come in after something has gotten bad.
Right. So that's a separate issue that doesn't require the president to sign off on it or the governor to ask. The agency also has grant programs where they send grants to local and state governments to fund things like emergency management departments and preparedness. So things like training, like public education, like equipment, alert systems. And Pennsylvania, like every other state in the country, really relies on this funding.
Does that response differ for like, Pittsburgh and Philly versus maybe like the middle of the state?
Yeah, so I think the counties and parts of the state that have fewer people and are more rural may rely on this funding more because they don't have other resources. They tend to be more underfunded than a bigger urban center. And so without this funding, they would really struggle to staff and fund their emergency management departments.
So what are you hearing from folks, with the threats that something like an organization like this that, I guess steps in on both ends of a natural disaster, like the preparedness piece, but also the response? What happens to all of us if it just goes away?
So there's a lot of concern from experts who work in emergency management and study disaster relief and the effects. FEMA is already understaffed. And so cuts to the agency and to the funding, and then the threats to completely dismantle or get rid of the agency are really making people fearful about what will happen when the next disaster comes, particularly because climate change is making severe weather more frequent and more common and more extreme. Our ability to recover, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationwide, is really compromised, and we need all of the help that we can get. I don't think that there's any state that can handle what's coming because of climate change on its own.
I feel like we're having this conversation about like the sky falling a little bit, but like it does sort of feel that way when we're talking about things like natural disasters, like tornadoes in Pittsburgh and hurricanes hitting Philly. I mean, can we absorb any of this, like any small piece of it, without federal help?
We really can't. I mean, there's ways that we can try to change the way that we spend our money and prioritize emergency management more, which we're not doing as much. But the truth is that Pennsylvania and even states like California, which are much bigger, won't be able to absorb the impacts of what's coming. It's just too big. And I think it's also really important to note that FEMA is not just about funding. It's not just about sending money to the state. FEMA also is really important for coordinating disaster relief. So they help organize the entire federal government's response. This is why FEMA was created.
I mean, I can see why that's like incredibly vital. Like a natural disaster does not care that we've drawn an arbitrary line between Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia.
Right. Most of these disasters, if you look at the list of things that affected Pennsylvania in the last few years, they hit other states too, because like you're saying, the storm does not like stop at the border with Ohio.
Today's show is supported by the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens and their newest exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated. The CityCast crew just checked it out. It's so vivid. There are 15 panels from artist Kara Walker. If you're not familiar with her work, in this series, she places black silhouettes on top of old Harper's Weekly engravings. It's easy to forget now, but back in the day, illustrations like these were the main way a lot of people interpreted what it meant to be at war. There is a lot of patriotism and not a lot of the many free and enslaved Black men and women who lived and fought and died during this war too. Also, the prints are paired with other Harper's Weekly illustrations, so you truly get a sense of how these stories were being told at the time. And because it's the Frick, a small bonus, they actually had the original bound copies of these Harper's Weekly illustrations. Like they were just in the house, handy, ready to go, and perfect for a show like Kara Walker's. The whole experience is just such a striking and visual reminder of what you often don't see in depictions of things like the Civil War. We highly recommend it. Get your tickets to Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, now through May 25th. And learn more at thefrickpittsburgh.org. If you're ready for a great night out, the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra is shaking things up with a different way to do classical. Their Disrupt concerts are short, they are relaxed, they are often themed, and they have legitimately fun activities to do too. The PSO has 2 remaining Disrupt shows coming up this spring. First, there's Hope and Resistance featuring Prokofiev's 5th Symphony. That's March 8th. It is a masterpiece and a glimpse into history. Then Love Struck on April 10th, featuring the greatest love story ever told, Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. You'll get closer to the music as the PSO's onstage host guides you through every thrilling movement of these iconic works. Plus, did I mention that they are short? The performances are only 60 minutes long. But Disrupt is more than a concert, it's a vibe. It's an experience. Grab a craft cocktail and just enjoy the live music in a very chill, come-as-you-are atmosphere. No dress code, no rules, just a perfect evening in Pittsburgh. Shake up your night at pittsburghsymphony.org/disrupt. Tickets start at just $25.
Ready to conquer your next big challenge? Make 2025 your medal year by signing up for the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon weekend of events. Happening May 3rd and 4th in Pittsburgh, it's more than a marathon. Choose from a marathon, relay, 5K, and more. And if you prefer walking, join the popular half marathon walking division. The Pittsburgh Marathon isn't just about running. It's about community, celebration, and pushing yourself to new limits. Over 300,000 fans will be cheering you on through the streets of the Steel City. And the hardest step is the first one, signing up. A registration today is a commitment to your future self. Join the excitement by visiting thepittsburghmarathon.com. Use CityCast15 to save 15% off any event registration. That's thepittsburghmarathon.com. And again, use that code, CityCast15, for 15% off any event.
I guess as you step back from all of this, is there anything that you are seeing maybe our scientific community, policymakers, lawmakers doing to try to prepare for either losing FEMA or just having a much more disaster-prone Pennsylvania?
So there are lots of people who are working on this problem and thinking about it, which is a good thing. It's a difficult time right now for emergency managers and people who do this work, but there are many smart people working on the problem. I attended a conference at Drexel University a few weeks ago that was specifically trying to bring together different people who work on emergency management and preparedness, like government officials and scientists and activists and community leaders, to kind of work together and brainstorm how we can plan better. And they are also responding and thinking about, what can we do in the absence of federal leadership on this problem.
I mean, did you hear anything that, filled you with hope or brought the point home in some funny or, poignant way?
I don't know that anything filled me with hope. It was a conference about disasters and
That's the spirit,
planning
Kylie.
for emergencies. But I think what filled me with hope is that it was a room full of really smart, resourceful people. And it does make me hopeful that they are thinking about this problem, they're tackling it, and they're thinking about how to collaborate in ways that they can try to fill the gaps that might be left by the federal government.
Were there any, was this a fact-finding thing, or were there any smart ideas that felt, actionable to someone like you who follows all this?
I don't know. I think that the goal of the conference was for people to collaborate and brainstorm, and then they were going to make a report where they talked about hopefully making actionable items.
Yeah.
But honestly, just bringing all of those people together in the same room and having them communicate directly about what is being missed and what we need to talk about more is really, really important. And I think goes a long way towards changing the way that we deal with these disasters.
We know from experience around here, it helps to put a face with a name. So I'm glad the smart folks are talking. What about individuals? An average Pittsburgher who hears this, is there anything that you think they can do, to influence a lawmaker or to prepare, their own home?
Sure. I think that paying attention to what your local government does about this issue, thinking about the emergency management departments that exist at the state level, and then your municipal or city government, and signing up for alerts and notifications. And then critically, when you get those alerts and notifications, listening to them, not disregarding them. I think that for Pennsylvanians, this is a particularly important thing with something like a tornado, where we're not as used to tornadoes. It's just not, it's more unfamiliar to us than, say, in Oklahoma. And so I think some people in the state have a tendency to be like, oh, well, there's a tornado warning. It's not going to affect me. I won't take it that seriously.
Yeah, there's not the muscle memory here for what it means to shelter for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Learn the difference between a watch and a warning, and pay attention to what the warning says. If it says to shelter in place, then shelter in place.
Yeah. Warning, by the way, for those listening, means that one has been spotted in your area. So
yes,
please do
it's
pay
much
attention.
more serious. A watch is more just be on alert, pay attention.
The conditions are right for it, not that it's actually happening. Grew up in Tornado Alley myself, so I know this one to my core. Well, what do you think is going to happen? I feel like we're all living in this space right now where we're hearing a lot of threats. The government's trying to, quote unquote, find efficiencies. These organizations are being told that they may or may not exist in a matter of weeks or months. Do you think that this will actually happen, that, FEMA will just cease to be?
It seems certain that there will be changes at FEMA, but we don't know what they will be yet. I think in the last week, the Trump administration fired more than 200 probationary employees at FEMA.
Which means that they were somewhat new to their role.
Right. So they had been there for less than a year. And the agency was also directed to make a list of other employees to get rid of, and they were told to specifically target anyone who was working on climate, on environmental justice, or on diversity issues. So keep in mind, as we mentioned before, that FEMA is already understaffed. And so losing these people is really bad. I think that it's one of those things where we might not see an effect immediately of these cuts, but the next time there is a major disaster, we will feel it. Trump has also said that he wants FEMA to go away and he wants funding to go directly to the state and have the state spend funding. He said, "I'd like to see the states take care of disasters," quote. He also signed an executive order that created a council to assess FEMA and potentially overhaul the agency, but it's not clear what might come of that.
Do we have any sense of a timeline for any of this?
So I believe that the council is supposed to return with a report within 180 days. So I might, sort of expect to see maybe some update in that time frame. And, it's possible that they'll continue to eliminate and get rid of employees over that time, too.
Well, while we've got you, Kylie, are there any other maybe potential Trump policy changes that you're watching, maybe relevant to here in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania?
Sure. And relevant to this issue, too, to severe weather and natural disasters, the Trump administration has really prioritized increasing fossil fuel production, which is very relevant to Western Pennsylvania because it's a center of natural gas production, but also because the more greenhouse gases that we release into the atmosphere and the less we do to combat climate change, the more this is going to be a problem. Pennsylvania experienced the same number of severe weather disasters that were over $1 billion in 2024 that it did in the entire decade of the 1980s. And so this is a problem that is accelerating. And the Trump administration, in addition to wanting to increase fossil fuel production, they've also targeted anything, funds, programs, departments that are working on climate change. And so those two things together is a recipe for accelerating climate change. And that is also a recipe for increasing these severe weather events.
And we also have a governor, of course, that has said many times that he believes in the all of the above energy policy, which, includes climate change, but it also allows for a lot of these changes to fossil fuels.
Right. So one of the things that I think is interesting about Trump's executive order on energy called Unleashing American Energy is that he talks a lot about how we're going to increase production and, there will be no ceiling, basically. But in Pennsylvania, we are kind of topping out already. Natural gas production in Pennsylvania hit record highs during the Biden years, even higher.
We make so much of it. There's not enough people to buy it as it is.
Right, exactly. We are making there's not a lack of natural gas being produced in Pennsylvania. So this question about unleashing American energy, it's unclear what that really will mean in the context of Pennsylvania.
Well, Kylie, we will stay focused on your excellent work. Thank you, as always, for just keeping an eye on all of this stuff and explaining it to us, too.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. We will be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. Does energy need to be unleashed? I don't know. It's not a dragon.
In Pennsylvania, there's no evidence that we're not already unleashing it.